ICPN Preservation Series webinar. We are recording today's session on assessing collections for preservation needs, and it will be served in its entirety on our website shortly after the presentation. Thanks to the Illinois State Library and Debbie Aggert for hosting all of our webinar series, and this one as well. Also, thank you to the ICPN Steering Committee and the IMLS, whose funding of the Connecting to Collections program make this series possible. I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today, presenting on assessing collections for preservation needs, Jennifer Hain Tepper. Jennifer is a lead partner in the ICPN and also has the distinct honor of presenting or co-presenting on 5 of our preservation web series presentations. I will turn it over to Jennifer and look forward to her presentation today. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please type them in and we'll get to them during the presentation or at the end.
Okay, thanks, Bronwyn. Sorry for the mix-up. I hope that everybody has transferred over at this point, and we're going to do this for take 2. So I'm going to chat a little bit less since we're starting a good 20 minutes late now, and try to still hopefully get you all out of here roughly on time. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start the topic. I only got about 4 slides in, so you didn't miss too much, and we'll start over. So what I'm going to try to cover today is going over a basic overview of some of the terminology that I'll be talking about today, just to kind of set the stage. Talking a bit about preservation planning and how assessments fit into the preservation planning process. Talk the brunt of this presentation about collection assessments and what collection assessments typically are going to involve, and some resources for learning more about assessments and assessment programs. Talk a bit about surveys, both the differences between a condition and an action survey, and then how different approaches to surveys, being sample versus item level approaches. Not going to go into a whole lot of detail with surveys because surveys are very, very dependent upon the collection material type that you own. And since you all are a mixed audience, at least I'm assuming you're a mixed audience right now. Frequently, we've got both library, museum, and archives people on these. There are lots and lots and lots of different approaches to surveys, and so I'm not going to be able to give you that information specifically. There are some wonderful resources available to you for that. And then lastly, Bronwyn's going to come in at the end and show you some of the loanable equipment that the ICPN has available to its membership for free. And to go over how some of that material can be utilized in assessment planning. So, okay, so Sherilyn Ogden has a great definition of the preservation planning process, and I really can't do it any better than Sherilyn already has. So she defines preservation planning as the process by which the general and specific needs for the care of collections are determined, priorities are established, and resources of implementation are identified. It defines a course of action that will allow an institution to set its present and future preservation agendas. It also prioritizes actions to help allocate limited resources appropriately. So there are some very key pieces of information here in the composition of a preservation plan. Some of the key things are establishing priorities. This is critical. None of us have enough resources, and all of us have, I'm sure, unless someone out there is much better off than most of us. Maybe the Eli Lilly company, Caitlin, perhaps, but I'd wager even some of those private libraries and archives have more preservation needs than we're going to have resources available to us. And so establishing preservation priorities and understanding how you're going to utilize your more limited resources are actually a critical component of the preservation planning process. It's also going to look at the general and specific needs of your collections. And that is going to look at very large things such as policies and procedures and facilities, as well as very specific things as far as what books need boxes or what materials need better shelving or better handling procedures or things like that. So it drills down to the very, very specific, but also expands up to the much, much larger. It's looking at the present and then trying to extend out to the future. And the really important thing in a preservation plan, and the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, are going through and doing a preservation plan right now. Our other one expired some years ago, and we've gotten out of practice and are going through the process of getting a new plan in place right now. And it's actually a very, very valuable process because what it does is it forces you to step back and look at the overall state of your collection, because many of us become completely overwhelmed with what is right in front of us and whose wheel is the squeakiest right now. And the process of preservation planning forces you to step back and say, okay, ignoring the squeaky wheels, what are the most pressing preservation needs? What are the largest needs? What are the most addressable needs? And what are the ones where we need a lot in place before we can address them? So, for instance, you're going to want to have very realistic expectations of what you think you can accomplish with the resources that you have right now to move forward on some preservation agendas. But you also want to take a lot of that information and think about what are your pie in the sky goals that you may not be able to accomplish right now. But if a major donor were to come to your door and say, I have $500,000, what would you like to do with it? That you have ideas already written down and strategies already in place, and you're not left scrambling, because oftentimes we don't make our best decisions when we're doing them last minute. So having thought about this, likewise, thinking about some of those larger goals, because those will help you to communicate those goals outward so that people can understand, why are you not doing some of these bigger things? Well, there are very good reasons why we can't accomplish them right now, and these are the things that need to happen to be able to get them. And it's not always just money. A lot of times it's procedural, or it's institutional infrastructure, or it's staffing, or something else that may be hindering you from being able to do something you want to do. But the preservation plan is supposed to outline all of that. So the thing that we're going to be talking about the most today is the collection needs assessment, or the general preservation assessment. An assessment is going to look very broadly at lots of different things and how all of them are going to influence the preservation of your collections. So it's going to look at things like policies and practices, the conditions of an institution, and it doesn't just mean the condition of the collections, that really does mean the condition of the facilities that house the collections as well. And looking at all of those and how all of those relatively then tie together to be able to address the preservation of the collection or the lack of preservation of the collection. It does often look at the general state of the collection. Sometimes they don't. Not all general assessments are going to actually look at the physical condition of your collections, but most are going to want to tie into that. So unless you already have a really good understanding of that before you start the assessment oftentimes is going to tie into understanding the general state of the collections and how many of those bigger picture pieces then filter down and influence the overall condition of your collection. It is going to identify very specific needs, and then the goal of a preservation assessment at the end is to put out in report form recommended actions and priorities for those actions. And the actions, kind of like the preservation plan, should then be some very realistic and short term, and some longer term and or pie in the sky. And setting some priorities for those. What are going to have the largest impact versus perhaps what is the most achievable, and kind of scaling those in some way so that people can easily identify, okay, what can we do right now that is going to have some significant impact on the collections versus where should I really be focusing, say, my fundraising efforts or a lot of my limited discussion with my director to try to advance my program. What are the things that I should really be trying to focus on? There are two different types of surveys then that can be utilized as part of an assessment when you're looking at the condition of those specific collections, or could be done completely independently of an assessment and done strictly as a standalone survey. And many of us in the preservation and conservation field do lots and lots of surveys where they're not necessarily tying into the assessment process, assuming that we already had an assessment in place. Assessment is the place you want to start. A survey may be part of an assessment, or it may build off of an assessment later on. But there are two different approaches to surveys. And today's talk is not going to go into depth with surveys at all, really, because surveys are very, very dependent upon the type of collection material that you own. And since you all are a very diverse group, again, I can't really go into that level of detail. And I apologize, I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm going to have to sip a little water periodically. So the first type of survey, which is by far the most common, is going to be a condition survey. And a condition survey is, I apologize, designed to look at the physical condition of a given collection and to combine observations about the damage and deterioration, and sometimes ties those in with other outside influencing factors such as incidence of use or the area that it's housed in or the date it was published in or something like that. Sometimes really it is just a condition survey of a given collection, not looking at outside influences whatsoever. But oftentimes what we're trying to do through a survey is to generate some understanding of why we're seeing the damage that we're seeing. And tying that in with those outside influences often gives us some of that information. it is still very valuable for us to go through a collection and say, look at a set of, I don't know, 30,000 historic photographs, and to get a sense of what is the condition of our photographic collection, because that data alone will be great fodder to be able to assist you in moving forward in, say, grant proposals or something like that. So condition surveys are usually key in contextualizing as well as outlining and, what's the word I'm looking for, being able to assign numeric values to the deterioration that you're seeing, so that you can actually say, well, this many, just taking that photographic sample, this many pieces in my collection are curled and would therefore need to be, something needs to be done to them because they are curled, because they're not accessible in their curled format. This many of our albumin photographs are faded to the point of barely being visible. And these are the problems that brings about as far as use to that collection goes. A more useful approach to survey, and you can see me stumbling over it a little bit there and trying not to do this, is looking at an action survey. And the difference between a condition survey and an action survey is that a condition survey just looks at, what are you seeing in front of you? What damage are you seeing? How are you going to record the damage that you're seeing? How are you going to be able to identify it statistically? An action survey is still statistically based and is still looking conceivably at exactly the same materials. But as opposed to looking at and recording the damage that you're seeing, it's looking at the damaged material, but recording what needs to be done. And this is actually a far more useful approach if you have the expertise to be able to do it. Because what it's doing then is saying, okay, well, these rolled photos need to be humidified and flattened. Well, I know from experience that humidification and flattening will take approximately this long per photograph and this much material. And so therefore, through those statistics, I can actually project how much a project would cost and how long it would take for the data that I have collected. And that is much, much, much more meaningful when you're looking at trying to come up with some sort of budget for either a grant or an internal project. Many of us will do condition surveys, call it a condition survey. The data we're collecting looks like a condition survey, but in the back of our heads, we're thinking about the action survey. Many of us don't go into an action survey strictly with no recognition of what condition we're seeing and how it influences the action we're going to take. So there's a very gray area between these two, and they're often not a very black and white application. But they are two different approaches because the data you're looking to get at the end is quite different. So it's important to understand those two, and I won't dwell on those too much longer. And I am going to hop over and turn off my email, which I forgot to turn back off. So I stopped bleeping emails on here. I apologize. So back to assessments then. Why would you perform an assessment or a survey as part of an assessment? And I think I sort of already hopefully have sold that to you a little bit. I mean, it's a really valuable planning tool. It really helps you to strategize your limited resources and make sure that you're focusing on those pieces of your collection or those areas of your collection that strategically make the most sense for you to be focusing on. I mean, to put it colloquially, to get the most bang for your buck. So what it's going to do is it's going to help you contextualize the overall preservation needs of your institution collections to make sure that you're not just missing something. Because I said, sometimes we get mired in the details and we forget to look for the larger picture and we stop seeing some things. And so the assessment process really helps us to open our eyes and make sure we're seeing everything. It also is going to be able to hopefully help you predict things in the future to anticipate future budget needs. And all of us always need to be able to help us look into the future and project what's coming down the pike. So fairly quickly, and I apologize, but again, I'm trying to catch up on time here. I wanted to go over sort of the standard assessment components. Not every assessment is going to include this, and I'll take you to some resources that give you great outlines about the really nitpicky detail that people are searching for in assessments. But broadly speaking, what a larger preservation assessment typically is going to contain. And the first one is they're going to look at your building, because clearly the way your building protects your collection obviously has immediate ramifications on the condition of your collection. So it's going to look at things like climate control. Do you have HVAC? Is it on all the time? Do you have humidification control or just temperature control? Is your HVAC window units or is it a solid air handling unit? What kind of energy efficiency does it? And while that doesn't seem like it's going to have direct ramifications upon the collection, it actually does. Because with a lot of us looking at energy sustainability, there are lots of arguments for us to scale back some of our HVAC. And there are a lot of arguments right now that say, well, done correctly, that's actually fine, but not done intelligently, that can have really bad influences on our collection. So making sure you understand how energy efficiency is changing the way we are using our environmental controls. Light control. Are you blasting all of your things with natural light through windows, or do you have unfiltered fluorescent tubes that are frying your books with UV light? Pest control. Do you have bugs? Do you know if you have bugs? Because a part of pest control is just knowing what's out there. General housekeeping. How clean is your space? Understanding your fire protection and your water protection. If you have a leak, do you have any alarms that tell you that you have a leak? If you have a fire, do you have a fire suppression system that's going to put that fire out? Or just smoke alarms that are going to bleep and call the fire department? Or do you not even have that? What sort of security do you have in place? Because security is a huge part of preservation, because if the materials go away because they were stolen, that is a preservation issue. They're no longer there. So the two of those obviously tie in very closely hand in hand. So that's sort of larger pieces that would be encompassed into this building environment category. You're obviously going to look at characteristics of the building, basic things like structure. Do you have a big flat roof that leaks all the time? Do you have things like skylights, which are prone to leaking? Do you have giant walls of windows, which let a huge amounts of light radiation through? All of these are going to influence what kind of controls you have over your collection and what kind of risk your collections are at. What sort of maintenance schedule do you have? We here at the U of I have what's called deferred maintenance, which means that nothing ain't fixed until it's broken, which often does cause some problems because you have to wait for the roof to leak before your roof gets fixed. So that can present challenges from a preservation scenario. Policies, actually, as they apply to your facilities, are also included here. So emergency preparedness is not just collections. It's obviously responding to your building as well. And most emergencies are also facilities emergencies. They're not just collection emergencies. They're also frequently personnel emergencies. So all of these tie in together, but making sure that you have emergency preparedness and disaster planning down, and that you have procedures down for those. It's going to look at the condition of your storage and exhibit areas. I'm assuming that almost all people are going to have some storage and some exhibit area. Obviously, the balance of those two shifts dramatically between small museums and large museums, small archives and libraries, large archives and libraries versus museums. All of these are very different balances. But nonetheless, all of us are going to have at least some of each of those. And both of them, we're going to look at things like, what type of shelving do you have? Do you have lots of stuff on crummy old particle board or wood shelving, which off-gases and is generally very unstable? Do you have really, really pretty hardwood barrister bookcases, the lawyer bookcases, which are frequently built out of oak, which is one of the most unstable woods out there, even though it's beautiful, with these big glass fronts on it that just lock the off-gassing formaldehyde inside your barrister bookcase? Or do you have the ugly but exceedingly practical and preservation-friendly powder-coated steel shelving? And if so, how are things shelved on those shelves, regardless of what the shelving makeup is? For books, are you using appropriate bookends and making sure that everything's stacked nicely and shelved appropriately and not four-edge shelved? And I'm not going to go into any detail there. But for museum objects, are they secure on the shelf? Are they properly braced and supported, or do they wobble every time someone walks by? There are a lot of concerns, obviously, for museum objects as well. Do you have framed art just leaning on the floor somewhere, or do you have it hung appropriately? Do you have it fried in the light, or do you have it covered so it's in dark storage? Do you have lots of rolled materials, or do you have flat files that you can actually unroll materials and store them flat? What is the general orderliness and accessibility? If you can't find something, you might as well not have it. And this is a big problem with any institution, is inevitably you have those kind of dark corners where things go to die. And that's obviously not a goal for any of us. So what is the orderliness and accessibility of your collection? Do you have large piles of unprocessed material, or by and large, are you fairly on top of processing your collection? What is the potential for damage over time due to your storage and exhibit areas? And this gets to light levels, proper supports, et cetera, et cetera. But looking at long-term, what are the effects of long-term storage? And many will have permanent exhibits as well. And what can be the effects of permanent exhibit or even short-term exhibit for certain materials? And how are you considering that with a preservation perspective? I said many of these assessments are going to look at collection conditions specifically. I can't go into a lot of detail here because we have so much variety, but obviously we have lots of different types of materials here. We have bound and paper materials, we have fine arts, we have natural history, we have photographs, we have ethnographic material, we have historical material. All of these materials are going to have different types of approaches to looking at the condition of those materials. Some of them are going to be very self-evident to the completely untrained eye. Every one of these types of collections are probably going to have more subtleties, where if you're coming at this as a non-specialist, you want to make sure that you understand what you should be looking for, and or thinking about bringing in a professional to be able to look at them, because some of the keys to understanding, especially large like collection-wide deterioration, may not be something that immediately jumps out at you as being a problem. But that's what preservation professionals are for. You obviously want to look at storage and handling practices. So does your institution use protective enclosures and boxes for the storage of materials, or is everything just out open on the shelf? How do you retrieve materials from storage? How do you train your staff to do it? Do you have completely open shelves to the public? How does the public interface with your collection? So understanding that. And then obviously staff and user here, handling. And how are those materials being handled? And are you taking preservation into consideration when materials are being handled? You want to look at this is one of those terms that's completely different across the different fields that I'm talking to right now, but the registration / cataloging / access to your collections. How are you labeling your material and making it findable and contextualizable? For libraries, that is the cataloging process and giving things call numbers and giving things different kinds of subject headings so that people can find your stuff and you can sort it in a logical manner. For museums, that's going through the registration process and accessioning materials into your collection, but also how are you making those records accessible so that other people can understand your collection if your collection is open for research. If it's not open for research, at least how are you making it accessible to your curators and whatnot so that they obviously know what you have in your collection when you're thinking about exhibits and whatnot. So how searchable is it? Are things findable and shareable? You know, we are in a very, very shareable world nowadays. And so looking at getting records out there for people to see more broadly on the web is something that a lot of people are pushing for. Are you digitizing material? This certainly is bread and butter for libraries now, but museums are totally on board. How much of your collection is available digitally anymore? Not anymore. How much of your collection is available digitally now, and how much you're trying to get available digitally in the future? That has a lot to do with access, but it influences preservation quite a bit. So taking that into consideration too. And it has good and bad influences on preservation. So I won't go into too much detail there. What kind of physical treatments do you have available to you immediately and maybe not so immediately? So do you have staff who's at least in charge of caring for the physical collection at some level? Just basic cleaning, shelving, looking at physical stability and trying to address immediate issues, string tying things or earmarking things for boxes at the very least. Do any of your staff have training on very basic levels of repair or cleaning? Depending on your material type, some of these are a lot more challenging to get even that level of training out to you. Textiles can be very challenging. Honestly, photographic collections can be very challenging. Any material, depending on the age and the fragility, can be very challenging, but some present more challenges than others. Historic firearms or giant trains or something are completely out of my league, at least, and I certainly have no training in that. But depending upon how wildly various your collection is, what type of collections do your staff have training to address? Is it all of it? Is it some of it? Is it any pieces of it? Do you have resources available to you to at least think about professional conservation when it's needed? And do you have professional conservators that you're aware of that you can work with? This is not something that's going to be available to all people, but obviously it's a really good thing if you can. So, preservation policies and management. This gets into much bigger picture, but looking at your entire institution, all of these different policies can influence preservation in one way or another. So does your mission statement say preservation? Ours does not. Ours says permanent access, but it does not actually say preservation, and I wish I could change that. It's really good to get preservation into your mission statement if you can, because it makes preservation planning a little bit easier in some ways to be able to cite back to the mission of your institution. But there are a lot of other general policies, and these are ones in libraries, but they probably carry over to museums. As a matter of fact, I know a lot of them carry over to museums as well. So things like, what are your gift policies? What are your loan policies? What are your security policies? What are your exhibit policies? How do you circulate things, if things circulate at all? Or how do you use your collection in different ways and register that use if it's not through circulation per se? What kind of collections care policies do you have in place? And then lastly, what sort of fundraising, what kind of programmatic fundraising do you do? Is it fairly haphazard? Do you have people whose part of their job is to do fundraising? And if so, are they considering preservation in their fundraising dialogue that they speak to donors or foundations or whatever with? So just checking chat here and making sure. Wanted to point you to a few resources, and in the sake of time, I was going to go through and actually walk you guys through very briefly each of these, but I think I'm not going to do that because I want to make sure that we end this on time. But I will describe each of these, and I will trust that you can go to the website after this is archived and check it out if you want to. There are two great national level preservation assessments that, if you're not familiar with them, really helps to set the stage for kind of what everybody is dealing with on national levels. And the UK and the US took two fairly different approaches to this. So it's worth looking at both just to understand how the data was collected and what they were looking at, because they definitely looked at things a little bit differently. But the Heritage Health Index was completed in 2005. So it's getting a little old at this point, but it still definitely underscores some of the key preservation needs and they looked at all types of collections, the key preservation needs found in the United States. And most of the needs that they cited in 2005 are still needs now. And it was the basis for all the funding that's come through the IMLS on this Connecting to Collections focused that this webinar and the ICPN are part of. So we're very grateful to the Heritage Health Index for being able to bring forth a lot of these issues, and education and training was a huge one. And so this was sort of the IMLS answer to that, but there's still lots and lots and lots to be done. Oh, wonderful. And Bronwyn says that they're about to start on another Heritage Health Index, which is awesome. So we'll have an updated one not very shortly because it's a huge undertaking, but they'll be starting on it shortly. And it's a really worthwhile venture. So if any of them contact you, please, please, please participate. There are also some great resources for people about to undertake an assessment or wanting to have an assessment done to their collections. And I wanted to make sure that you are aware of all of these. The CAP program, the Conservation Assessment Program, is put through Heritage Preservation. And it is a program where you can actually request a CAP and get a CAP and have a professional come to your institution to do an assessment. But what I really like about CAP is not that functionality, although certainly that's very useful, and that parallels into a couple other resources that I'll point to. But they have a phenomenal amount of very useful information online, both for the people wanting an assessment and for the assessors. So if you are thinking about the possibility of trying to do an assessment on your own, that you have enough preservation background that you think this is something I can do, they have the full resources for their assessors up online that you can freely use. And it really does. It walks through how to be an assessor, what to look at, what you should think about, and then lists and lists of questions and things you should look for. Now, what it's not going to give you is how to digest that information and come up with those priorities. But it is going to be able to set the stage for you to make sure that you're not missing any key questions that you should be thinking about. And as someone who does do site visits and site assessments, I go back to CAP all the time, even as a library person, because these resources are really rich and really useful. So I really love the CAP site. The MAP program is put through the American Alliance for Museums, the AAM, which I cannot get used to that name change to save my life. And they have an assessment program which will act, if you are a museum, you can apply for and actually have someone come and do a conservation or preservation assessment of your collection through the AAM. And this is a really great resource. Not quite as much, at least that I can find, again, I'm not a museum person, that I can find online as far as information for the assessors that's freely open, but a really great resource for museums who might be looking at someone and wanting to have a professional come in to do an assessment. So I wanted to make sure that we touched on that. The Northeast Document Conservation Center, which focuses much more on graphic materials, has a wonderful preservation leaflet called Preservation Assessment and Planning, which is a wonderful overview to the whole process and goes through different approaches, some of the different nomenclature that I use, and some of the different resources available, particularly to libraries and archives, because again, they really focus on graphic documents. But it's a really great, reasonably short read. It's one of their technical leaflets, which are a really great series of information and really a wonderful introduction to the assessment process. And then lastly, old, I will admit, I think it's 88, but still exceedingly useful for libraries and archives is the RAMP study put out by UNESCO. This is, RAMP is the Resources for Archives and Museums program. And it does records and management program, and it is George Cunha, who actually started the NEDCC, to loop back to the previous one, actually put out this document that was one of the first really comprehensive approaches to looking at archives and record storage and the preservation assessment of archives and record storage holdings. And what he's drawn out, I mean, there are a few things that since '88 obviously have changed, but the vast majority of this document is actually really good. And what's nice about it is it's exceedingly approachable. While we go back to CAP, a lot of that is that for the assessors is written for people and they're assuming a certain level of understanding. The RAMP survey is written for people with little to no context. And so it goes through a lot of explanation of how to utilize the information, how to set priorities, and then actually gives you lots of questions and things to look for. So I really, despite it being as old as it is, really like the RAMP survey and find myself going back to and recommending the RAMP survey a lot. So don't discount it just because it's old. So I wanted to also talk now briefly about the condition and action surveys and how they can be utilized. So I already defined the two, but there are approaches to both of them that have significant impact on how you can utilize the data that you collect. So if you are considering a survey, either as part of an assessment or separately, what you want to consider is, are you going to look at the entire collection? Which if your collection is 20 pieces is totally feasible. If your collection is 30,000 pieces, maybe not as doable. If your collection is 1,000 pieces, maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. Item level is going to give you by far the most reliable data. And if you're looking at trying to actually prioritize what you are going to do to the collection and which pieces you're going to do it to, an item level survey is the only way you're going to get that information, because it requires that you look at every single individual piece. So the smaller the collection, the easier and more accessible the item level survey is, but you're going to get a lot more meaningful data from an item level survey. For really big collections, and what we usually, if we're going to do a survey as part of an assessment, what we usually utilize, because we're inevitably looking at larger collections and the survey is a very small component of an assessment, is what's called a sample survey. And a sample survey means that you are looking at a very small portion of your collection and utilizing the data that you collected to be representative of the larger collection. And it's really important that you approach this the right way to get the most meaningful data from your sample survey as possible. So I'm going to dwell on this just momentarily and give you all glassed over statistics eyes. There are a few terminologies that you need to go into if you're looking at doing a sample survey. The population, which is the overall size of your collection. Your confidence, how sure do you want to be that the data you're collecting is representative of the entire collection, not just of the sample. And then the tolerance, which is basically your margin of error. So if you want to say that I am 95% confident, plus or minus 5, that the margin of error is that plus or minus 5. So you're giving yourself a spread of how confident you are. I'm really confident within this margin of error. And the smaller the margin of error and the higher the confidence, the more pieces you obviously need to look at to achieve that. And all of this is based off the fact that you need to be doing a random sample, and it needs to be statistically random. And this is where a lot of people fall down. You don't have to approach it this way, but if you want to say that you have a statistically accurate sample, this is the way you need to approach it. There are lots of other ways to approach sampling. You could go every 10 piece or something like that, but that usually is going to bring in some level of bias into your sample. That means that you can't say that you are absolutely confident that this is representative of this percentage of your collection. What it means is that you think it's pretty good, but you really can't define how good is good. The only way to be able to define how good is good, which is a real bonus when you're looking at things like grant applications, is to do the statistically valid sample with this confidence and tolerance interval. Sorry, saw things flickering in chat, but nothing seems to have come up. So just to define that so people understand, and I said I'm not going to dwell on this, I just want to make sure that people are aware of this if you're going to embark on something. If you say you want a survey that is going to have a confidence of 95 with a tolerance of plus or minus 2, which is an exceedingly accurate survey, then what it means is that if you did that same survey on a random sample 100 times, 95 times that you did it, your sample would come back within that plus or minus 2 margin of error of the data that you collected, which is pretty darn good. Now, you have a 5% chance that whatever the sample is in that 5% that's outside of your confidence and tolerance. But that is the smaller that, the higher that 95% is, the less likely it is that you have gone into that area. There's no way without doing a complete item level survey to say there is no risk of that. But the more stuff you look at, the higher your confidence, the higher your tolerance, and the less the risk is of getting some aberrant data. One way that you can look at determining a random sample then is, and this is just one of many sample size calculators up there online. I like this one because it seems to be persistently always there whenever I go to it. There are lots of them available. If you just Google sample size calculator or something like that, you'll find one of these. And so this example that's up online is, let me get my pointer here, is, whoops, looking at a 95% tolerance with or confidence with a 2% tolerance, like the example we just gave, and assuming in this case a collection of 1 million pieces, which is a pretty darn big collection. For libraries and archives, maybe not that big. For museums, it's getting fairly large, although there are many museums out there that are clearly a lot larger than that. And it's coming back then and saying that your sample size for that confidence and tolerance and that collection size is going to be 2,396 items, which is not a small undertaking. If we bumped down our confidence and tolerance, then we could definitely bump down our sample size. So you need to balance how accurate do you want your results to be with how much time do you have to actually perform the survey. So I'm not going to go into any more detail with that. I just wanted to put that out there to at least make sure that people were aware of that. If people have additional questions, you'll have my email at the end. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'll remove my arrow here, is that when you're done with a survey, what's going to get you to the information that you need to plug into an assessment then is going to be being able to prioritize things. And priority should not be just based on condition. Priority needs to be based on other outside influences, like some definition of value. Whether that value is the use of the material and whether that makes it more valuable to your collection, whether that is financial value and resale value, whether that is curatorial value and how that particular piece ties into your collection management plan and the overall theme of your institution. Likely all of you have different ways that you define use, and I know archivists have like 5 different clear distinctions of value. But you want to have some rhetoric, some rubric, sorry, of defining value and assigning that value to each piece that you're looking at, if possible, so that that can be weighed against the condition, and that helps you set much clearer, more strategic priorities. And the way you do that is through a matrix like this, where basically what you can do is say, okay, well, for the materials in exceedingly poor condition, when you're doing the survey, you would rank things with, you know, good condition, fair condition, poor condition, or something like that. For the materials in very poor condition and the materials that are of very high use or high value, those would be your very highest priority. For materials of low use and value and say only fair condition, you'd be looking at a reasonably low priority. And you can range then from obviously very low through medium through very high. If you give more factors across and down, instead of going 3 across and 3 down, if you went 5 across and 5 down, you could obviously stratify and pull that out even further to help to tease out your priorities. Because what happens is you usually end up with a huge amount of lumping in medium, and then inevitably pretty high numbers in high, and then a very few stragglers in very high, and then inevitably, scarily, not that much in low and very low. So the more levels you have, the more you can tease that out, but the more levels you have, the harder it is to assign them. So that's something just to keep in mind. And with that, I am a minute behind, a minute below, but I know Bronwyn wanted to at least quickly display some of the materials that we have that would help you in looking at some of these facilities issues that would be part of an assessment that you could utilize if you want to undertake one of these yourself or if you're bringing in someone. So I'm going to pass this off to Bronwyn, and hopefully you all can stay for another.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for condensing your talk. I know that a lot of great information there, and a little digging online, and you can find more information. I'm going to put Jennifer on the spot here for a second. Do you know who Desmond Llewellyn is, Jennifer? You probably muted your microphone, and I know you took your picture away. If anyone knows who Desmond Llewellyn is, can you text in? Oh, Jennifer's typing there. It has nothing to do with preservation at all. Like I said, I totally put Jennifer on the spot there. But in the interest of time, I'm going to tell you that Desmond Llewellyn was the first actor to play Q in the James Bond series, and I couldn't help feeling a little affinity towards Q last night as I was unpacking all these gadgets and getting ready to share them with you today. That's my segue into how you can get your hands on these great pieces. We have at the ICPN 5 pieces of equipment that you can borrow. I think this was forward thinking of the grant writers for this ICPN program. These mostly are expensive on their own, and collaterally the kits are quite expensive. You can borrow one or all 5 of the pieces. We will ship them to you. We'll ask that you pay the return shipping, so keep that in mind when you see the size of some of the things today. And we ask that you use a trackable shipping program. The kits are housed at the Illinois State Museum Collection Center, and I will give you the email address of the person to contact there who's going to be in charge of this loan program. Her name is Becky Dyer, and her email address, which we'll also post on our website. I'm not sure if right now it's my email address, and for the next couple of weeks you can continue to use that. And Mona has typed in Becky's email address there, so in the future use that, please. We are trying to institute about 6 weeks that people can borrow these. If you contact us and need to borrow things longer for a longer assessment, we can probably work something out, but just keep in mind that we only have 2 of each of these items and the entire state that we're trying to cover to lend these to. And also, of course, ask you to treat the things gently when you do receive them. You'll receive a booklet along with your items that you borrowed. It will have a user agreement in there, which you will sign one and return back to the Illinois State Museum. And it also has some supporting documents and information about how to use the tools and what information you might be able to glean from them. First, I want to show you a highly useful tool. This is called the PEM2 Preservation, excuse me as I find the camera here, Preservation Environment Monitor. This was designed by the Image Permanence Institute at Rochester Institute of Technology. It's very accurate and easy to use. It records temperature and humidity. It takes a reading every 5 minutes and plots a data point every 30 minutes. So you have very detailed charts when you're done. Leave it up as long as you like. It's small, as you can see. It can go in an exhibit case, in a storeroom very discreetly. When you're ready to retrieve the information, simply place this flash stick inside. It gives you some indication that it's working. You now have all the data on this flash stick. It writes it as a text file, Mac and PC compatible. Great tool. It's about all I'm going to say on that, just so we can get through everything. This is also temperature and humidity recording device. This is called a psychrometer, aspirated psychrometer. It's aspirated because, open it up here, it has a wet bulb and a dry bulb. And you will receive, the kit comes along, the tool comes with a bottle of distilled water. You wet the sock on that thermometer, turn it on. It does its job for a couple minutes. You watch the thermometers. The wet bulb is going to decrease rapidly And when it gets to a point that the gauges have stabilized, you use this slide chart, and don't be intimidated by it. Once you get the hang of it, it's real easy to use. And you can get your, you read your temperature off the dry thermometer, and you can get your humidity off of this gauge. Like I said, low tech, very easy to use. You can use either of these to calibrate your existing systems, show the information to your building staff, or make a case for poor environments in your institution, or good environments for that matter. This is another tool that we have, an infrared thermometer, IR thermometer. It is a non-contact temperature reading device. So inside an exhibit case, say that you'd like to know if your lights are generating heat. You just point and shoot. It couldn't be easier. And I don't know if I can get that to the camera. You can see I'm kind of pointing up to the ceiling here. I've also spoken with some people. Jennifer was telling me that at her libraries, they use these if they want to see if an air vent's working. So a lot of heating and air vents near the ceiling. You're not sure if it's turned on, if it's functioning properly. You just aim this up there. And so this is good for hard to reach places to get a temperature reading. This is probably the most difficult piece of equipment that we have to use. It does come with a complete instruction manual, and once you get the hang of it, it's not that difficult. This is a light monitor, and you can measure both UV, visible light on this. You can also download the data from this onto your computer. I haven't actually done that yet, so I won't say too much about that. But and it gives the light readings in lux or foot candles. You can change all the settings if you go into it. Oh, I'm not showing it there. There it is. The one thing that, while I have you guys all here, I would say was frustrating until I figured it out. If you push and hold the button you want until that dot comes in the corner, then you can watch and monitor the light levels. Otherwise, it has a tendency to cycle on and off quickly, which is frustrating.
What brand is the light monitor?
Oh, what brand is the light monitor? That is a good question. ELSEC, E-L-S-E-C. I believe they're made in England, and I got this from a company called Scientific Sales out of New Jersey, and they're easy to find on the web. And lastly, we have, I'm not going to take the trouble, well, maybe I will pull it around. So you can see, if you decide to borrow this, it's very compact as far as vacuums go, but it's large and quite heavy. It's not technically called a HEPA vacuum, but it does filter down to 0.3 micron, so it contains and collects and contains very small particles. We recommend it for cleaning storerooms. If you don't have a conservation staff and you need to clean an exhibit, I caution you about using it on artifacts. You can do a lot of damage with a strong vacuum. It does not have a, it does have a suction control dial. So if you are going to use it for cleaning of artifacts, I would reach out to a conservator first or look online. There are some good videos on cleaning. You want to avoid sucking your object up to the vacuum, and there are techniques and ways to do that. But again, also we were looking at it as a tool for cleaning your storerooms, anywhere you might need to generally maintain a good environment, dust-free environment. And those are the 5 things that we have to borrow, and hope that you'll take advantage of this program, because they're not doing anyone any good sitting at the Illinois State Museum. I appreciate all of your patience with our technical difficulties at the beginning of this presentation. We're just about 8 minutes over. If you have any more questions, continue to type them in. Otherwise, I'll say thank you to Jennifer for sharing all her vast knowledge once again with our group here. Looks like someone's typing a question in. And don't hesitate to contact Jennifer there or myself at the Illinois State Museum if we can be of further assistance. Yes, the entire program, including the slides and the audio, will be on the ICPN. It usually takes us a week and a half to get the archive version up on the ICPN website. But yes, it will be there. And I'm going to type in my email here just quickly. Okay, thanks again, and look forward to hearing from all of you so that we can send you some of this equipment.